Well, welcome back to our discussion that Brad Little, John, and I are having in terms of how the church should be operating in light of COVID and lockdowns and the civil magistrate and these sorts of things. And so we've been looking at, masks and matters of indifference in the last discussion. And so now I want to turn and ask, okay, so we've established, or you've established, that in principle these sorts of restrictions are valid, depending on the context. But in terms of like the actual practice, and even now turning right into the issue that we're dealing with the COVID lockdowns, how does that relate in terms of that validity?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to ask, which we did cover in an earlier video, is, is this genuinely a public health crisis? And I know, a number of people that I've talked to and that you've talked to who would dispute these restrictions would do so on the basis that they're convinced that this, that the public health crisis is really blown out of proportion.
It's a scamdemic, as people say.
Right, scamdemic. So, of course, the first question asking whether these particular restrictions are valid is to ask whether they are in response to a genuine public health crisis. And I know a lot of people who would dismiss the restrictions would also dismiss the severity of the pandemic. We dealt with this in an earlier video. I think, these folks are listening to, confusing disinformation in many cases. And in fact, the evidence is pretty clear. But even if it weren't, there is the important point of, this is what it means to live under the rule of law, under authority, is that these kinds of assessments about how dangerous is it really don't generally fall to us to make. Now, the second question though is, okay, let's say we got a serious pandemic. It is legitimate for church gatherings to be restricted in various ways, whether entirely prevented from worshiping or worshiping with masks or capacity limits. And of course, it's different all across the board. These kinds of restrictions are legitimate in principle, and the civil magistrate can make them. Okay, we've established all of that. Now, that still doesn't, just because you have the right to make a law doesn't mean that it's being well made. And I think one of the concerns that people would ask, well, are these restrictions really being made as a sort of matter of last resort? And this comes back to something we said earlier about, treating churches as non-essential and other things as essential. And we said, that's not the best language to use. What are they actually getting at? They're getting at the fact that, some things are easier to do without for a short period of time than others, even if they might be more important in a longer term sense, right? And I think we could say that's true of worship. But the fact remains, our authorities don't really think the work of the church is that important. And so it's, in many cases, it's been one of the first things to sort of cut off list. Okay, well, what can we get rid of? Well, we can definitely get rid of churches. Okay, what else? Yeah, all right, we'll close the strip clubs too, I guess. To that extent, I think Christians can ask and should ask. They can look at the laws that are being passed, and they should say, are churches being prioritized as much as reasonably possible? And in particular, I think the question there is, yes, there are unique. I think as Christians, we need to be serious about the fact that there are unique challenges that church services pose. There are very few other settings in daily life where people, maybe, which is kind of a sad thing. It didn't used to be this way, but nowadays it is unusual for people to sort of gather in large social settings with large groups of people on a regular basis. We just kind of go, sort of go do our private shopping, have our sort of small gatherings and so on. So churches pose a particular threat from a disease standpoint. But are there ways of accommodating churches? This is where, for instance, in some places, even I think in Canada, it's been an issue, even drive-in services have been banned. People are just sitting in their cars and, tuning in via, radio or whatever to worship, just to have a sense of being there in person, even if it's in many ways still, not that different than Zoom church. And I think in many cases what you have is civil authorities just not wanting to have a hassle of They don't want to have to monitor whether the drive-in services are actually, whether people are getting out of the car afterward or whatever. So it's easier for them just to say none of it, right? And yes, there are plenty of church buildings that could perhaps accommodate a smaller number of people with safe spacing and so on. Some buildings just really can't, others can. And it's easier for the civil authorities to just say, yeah, we're just going to ban all of it because we don't want the hassle of monitoring. And I think we should be honest with ourselves. I mean, many people making these complaints will also complain about big government, complain about nanny states, the micromanaging, bureaucrats everywhere. And part of this is an attempt, I think, not to micromanage, right? If they don't want to have to make case-by-case decisions, and so they just make an across-the-board decision. Nonetheless, I think the result in some cases has been that churches are under stricter restrictions than they really need to be from a public health standpoint, and are being treated unfairly relative to other kinds of businesses and gatherings. Of course, that might be true in British Columbia, but not in Ontario. It might be true in Canada, but not in the US. These are different state by state. And I think one of the things that I've seen is, has been an issue throughout this pandemic is our government still operates both in the US and Canada at a fairly local level. There's a lot of regional and local variation, but people's conversations are carried out in the undifferentiated international space of social media. And so it's, I see people in one state that has very little restrictions on churches, and they're getting all up in arms about another state 1,000 miles away that has much stricter restrictions. And not only are they getting up in arms on their behalf, but they are somehow sort of projecting that onto their own state has very lax restrictions, but even those restrictions are kind of seen through the lens of this draconian policy here. So I think, so people are just sort of reacting against what they see as draconian policy in general, when in fact the draconian policy might be confined only to particular jurisdictions.
So let's do a thought experiment for a quick second. So if an ideal sort of civil sphere or government would be what we might call a Christian kind of commonwealth, where you actually have Christians in the positions of the civil magistrate, how do you think it might look? What would be different? Would there be more of a priority? Okay, no, church is important. We need to really think through, maybe micromanage a little bit more. You thought a lot about that kind of Christian commonwealth type thing. What would that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what it would look like, and this is part of the issue, I suppose, that we have with gazillions of denominations, right, is that we can't have, to do it effectively, you would want to have someone, or maybe not one, but at least a relatively small number of people who could sort of speak for the church at a national level or state level or whatever. You could have the Archbishop of Virginia or whatever, who is in they're giving my letting my predilections be known, but the governor is actively consulting, in fact has to consult, right, legally, constitutionally has to consult with the Archbishop of Virginia on matters relating to the church in Virginia, and where you could have, and so then the church leadership is sort of tasked with, the governing officials can say to the church leadership, hey, we've got a real concern here. This is the public health situation. Here's the dangers we think churches pose. We need to figure out what to do here. Can you guys help us, go back to your people and see what you think you can do? And you'd want a much more active role for the church there in being part of the solution. And that's where, I think you don't have that kind of working relationship at all. And a lot of that's because we have constitutionally, at least in the US and Canada, I think we've constitutionally put, in Jefferson's words, a wall of separation there so that you can't cooperate, you can't dialogue. And therefore, as I said, the civil authorities, the easiest thing for them to do is just say, this is too much of a hassle for us we don't want to be in the business of trying to figure out how churches can worship safely. And to be honest, we don't trust every little small town pastor. This is what I've heard a lot of people saying, like, why can't we trust the church to make these decisions? Well, I'd be much more comfortable with that if we still had large, well-established denominations. But most churches in the U.S. are independent, non-denominational churches, often with very don't put a big priority on formal education for ministers. And frankly, I mean, I don't blame the civil magistrate for saying, I don't trust every little Bible church pastor to be able to make the best, most prudent decisions in this very complicated issue. And so the easiest thing to do, depending on the kind of political leaning, some states have said the easiest thing to do is just leave churches alone and recognize they're going to be driving a lot of the spread of the disease, but whatever, that's what you got, I guess, in like North Dakota, right? And then in Canada and California and, more liberal places, the tendency is to say, well, we don't trust the churches, so we're just going to come down really hard on them. But if you had more well-established unified church bodies that had a ongoing relationship of consultation with the civil authorities, then I think you could have a lot more of a kind of constructive problem-solving approach to this.
Yeah, I think you're right. A kind of a coming together of, the two spheres, if you want to put it that way, or the two kingdoms or whatever, but like that they're actually recognizing their rightful places and then consulting with one another in order to kind of how on a holistic level best to operate going forward. I think that's very good.
And I think we've even had, despite formal disestablishment, I think we had that to a much greater extent in the U.S. in the past, where there were a few large nationally recognized denominations, and the leaders within those churches, were recognized public figures who were invited to give input on political questions. And we certainly still have kind of celebrity pastors who sometimes have political impact, but I wouldn't say that they enjoy
the best example of that.
What's that?
Billy Graham is a good example. Paula White, maybe not so much.
Right. But it's become much more of an adversarial relationship and one characterized by distrust. And I think it's important to recognize, some people think that the privatization of the church and separation of church and state just gives the church freedom to do its own thing, but it also creates this barrier in which, in an increasingly post-Christian society, you have distrust between larger society and the church, and the way that distrust is going to, in times of crisis, that distrust is going to manifest in hostility to and restriction of the church, and that's shouldn't surprise us as kind of what would come out of a privatization of the church that we've seen over the last couple centuries.
That's interesting. That spurs a thought in terms of how divided, especially here in America, we are as a nation. I wonder if that lies behind some of this division, right? Because you have like the kind of like religious right to the evangelicals, and they're screaming for their voice to be heard, and then the government pushing back and whatever. If we actually had that kind of more of a kind of a relationship of consultation and understanding, what would the societal effect be, in terms of our politics right now? It's an interesting thought, at least.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I do hope comes out of this, at least, is it's been a trying time for the church and society, but thinking about how are ways in which we could reimagine the relationship of the institutional church to the society in a way that would actually be strengthen our politics rather than fragmenting them.
Well, it's a good spot to end this segment on. And so in the next one, we'll turn and think through what are appropriate remedies for all of this. Thank you.